let's create the functionality that will authenticate that user we created. We go to our main flow, and open our flow definition file. And okay, what we see here. Here's our view state for sign up with the view attached and the modal. So the first transition is transition back to the sign in form, and second is event that listen for confirm sign up events, and it contains the evaluation of following expression. So when we catch the following event, we create the user, and if create user operation were successful, then we redirect the user back to welcome view state, which is sign in. What we will do now, instead of redirecting to the welcome view state, now we will redirect its user to authentication action state. So I will type in here authentication and create new action state. Hit the control space, and the first is action state, and you can read the documentation of that tag. A state where one or more actions are executed. So this is a step where we do some logical operations, like a short explanation. So I click on action state, and the identifier will be this one, and inside that we will evaluate another expression which will contain the service invocation for authentication. So evaluate expression, and that expression can return Boolean type. So depending on if user were authenticated successfully, we can redirect the actual user to different view states. And that's why we create two new transitions. Transition on to and since Webflow version 2, the evaluation expression can return two values, which is similar to true or false, but just yes or no. It's the same thing. And if authentication went successful, then it returns yes, and then we send application user to end state, which will be with ID finish. We'll create it right now, and if no, let's say it will be redirected back to welcome view state. And I will create the end state. There's a thing called end state, this one, and actually this is the last state that can be included in single flow. You can put the actions in end state, and it also terminates this current flow at this stage. So let's put this tag here, and the end state ID will be, like I said, finish, and on finish end state we will redirect to view with some interesting value in it. So we type here that we wanna redirect to some external context. So we type external redirect. So external redirect colon, and here we put our account flow ID. Okay, good. And one single thing that we will forgot is expression. And here we wanna invoke some authentication service and pass that object instance to that service to authenticate it. So we don't have any services yet, so I will put here the initial service being name, which we'll create later, and it will be like user authentication, user authentication. Provider service. So user authentication provider service, and we will invoke some service method in it, like process user authentication, and path the user object instance. Good. I'll save it. Good. Once more. So we hit we pressed the sign up button and we ended up here. First, the expression will be evaluated. User will be created successfully, or the user creation will fail. In case if create user operation will fail, then Ajax messages will inform application user about that. And as long as there's error messages in Faces context, this transition to authentication will not gonna happen. In case if create user operation went successfully and there's no error messages in Faces context, then considering that user were added to the database table, Webflow will make transition to authentication action state. So we created user, now we try to authenticate it, and we end up here. Here we try to authenticate that user, and if the authentication went successful, we make transition to finish end state, and finish end state itself just makes the external redirect to our account flow. In case if authentication went, there was failure in authentication, we redirect back to welcome ViewState. You might ask why we need this transition to welcome if in the most cases this will always authenticate user successfully, because we just created the user, then we should be able successfully authenticate it right after. And my answer is just in case. Probably there is some cases when this could fail. For example, we created user but couldn't authenticate it for some unknown reasons. Then we should handle this case properly by saying, for example, sorry, we couldn't authenticate you automatically, so please go to the welcome, which is sign in form, and try to authenticate manually, like this, yeah? But I agree, this is a rare case. Usually it will go this way. So we create the user, we authenticate it, and then send the actual user to his account. 3 steps. Probably you can look at the flow graph, which looks like this. a little bit disorganized. I don't know why actually I can't move these. But okay, even this way it's clear enough. So here's our sign in and sign up view states and the navigation between these two view states. So we click new user, we go to sign up. If we click back to sign in, we go back. So if we ended up in sign up, we confirm sign up, then authentication takes place. If no, then we go back to the sign in. If yes, we go to finish, and there's a external redirect to the account. And if in this sign up view state the user were not created, for example, because of that user already exists in database, then all the error messages are handled by Ajax inside this view state without any transitions and any flashing screen flashings, so that all validation and error messages happens inside view itself. I hope this is clear. And actually these all can be implemented in a couple of different ways, so it's up to developer how much to use the Webflow in logic processing. I just decided if we want to use Webflow, then we should use cool features of Webflow as much as possible. Now we need to create this service. Let's go to our services package, and inside that create the interface of I'll copy this name, interface, the capital letter, finish. Provides processing service user, something like this, and one single method inside with the return type boolean, and the method name was process user authentication, which receives the user entity. User entity. So let's go and implement this. Copy the interface name so that you can paste the implementing class name. Okay. Go to the service implementation package and create new class. Name user authentication provider service impl. Finish. Let's implement our interface. Yeah. Add unimplemented methods. We will provide the implementation of that method, but before we need to add another service here in a class, which will be private field, and guess what, it will be authentication manager. interface from the Spring Framework Security authentication. Create the getter setter methods for it. After the method public. Good. We need to create the dependency injection in this field, so I'll go to the application context where we define our beans. And right after user service, I'll create new service bean. And by the way, you can also create beans through the UI, which is like a new bean. Then you provide ID, then implementation class. Okay, let's try it. So I need to create the bean with ID like our interface. I put the create new bean ID user authentication provider service implementing class will be, and you see that it automatically searches for implementation classes, and this is exactly what we need. So I click OK and finish, and let's see how it's added the new bean, and yeah, here's it. And this is exactly what we will use in our flow definition file here. We use that bean reference defined here. I think it's clear. And as I said, we need to inject the implementation for that authentication manager interface. So we put here property, and reference that name authentication manager exactly as it typed here, and put the reference to authentication manager we created in one of our previous videos, if you can remember. This was in security config, and here's it. So we use this authentication manager with the DAO authentication provider, where we use our own user detail service implementation here. So I copy this and put here. So I save this, and now is the interesting part. Here we need to create the authentication request object, which will look like this. We need authentication interface from Spring Security Core package, and we'll call it request equals, let's create the new implementation, which will be username password filter not token, this one, username password authentication token. Enter, and I must pass the username and password to the constructor of that class, which I get from our user entity we receive in that method. User get username, and here user get password. So now our authentication request is ready to be processed, and we invoke authentication manager, and method of that authenticate, and pass that request to that method to process authentication. Good. This method itself returns the authentication result object, which reference we need to obtain. So, and I call it result. So I put the request to authenticate and got the authentication result. So now when we have a result, we can set the authentication session to our security context, which we will do by following. Security context holder from security context package. So we get the context and set the authentication, and we need to pass that authentication result object here. Good. And we return true at this point. But the authentication can go wrong. You see that authenticate method can throw the authentication exception, and this is thrown in case if user can't be authenticated, probably because it does not exist. And that's why we need to properly handle this exception in our logic here. So we need to define the try catch block. Let's see. Try and here we must try to catch this exception. Copy, paste, import, and this goes from this package, exception, and here we probably return false because the user authentication went wrong. It wasn't authenticated. So, but additionally, we need to provide the application user with some information message, and we do this following. We need to obtain the faces context, current faces context, to put the message that user will come up with. So, faces context from JavaX faces context package, get current instance, add message. Actually, don't remember what was the first attribute here. Yeah, I think this was the identifier of the message component, which actually we do not need now. So I'll put here null, and in the second we need to create the new faces message instance. Faces message. This one. Here we need to put the severity, which we do by using the faces message constant. Severity will be error. The summary will be actually our message, which we'll get from authentication exception instance. Get message, and this is just the details. I don't use it. Let's put here just sorry. And I think this is it. So we return true or false. Now this method authenticate, we'll discuss it. Unfortunately, this will lead to call one of our methods which we left without implementation in our previous videos. And this will happen because the authentication manager, which is configured in our security config here, we use our user detail service implementation here, and when we invoke that authenticate method, there's a chain of dependencies invoked where our user service will be used also, and if more precise, it will use that one single method from the user detail service interface. And let's go to our user service implementation, and here we implement the user detail service and the method from that interface which we left empty. Here's it. So when we will invoke this method, it will lead to this method invocation through the chain of dependencies. So let's provide the implementation for that one. I'll save this. And the main objective here is to return the constructed user details implementation. And the simplest one, user details implementation, is the user from the Spring Framework Security Core user details package. So I'll create instance of it, and user details, create new instance. Okay, and the simplest one, the simplest constructor will be we need to pass the username, the password, and the authorities, which basically is the privileges that that user will have. So where we gonna get it? Just a moment. Okay, we return that user details, and we need to get the user with that specific username for the database first. So here, user entity. This is our own user entity, user, and we use our user DAO to obtain that user from database. User DAO, and here's the method load user by username, which we previously created in one of the previous videos, and pass that username we receive in our implemented method. Good. And this method will return the user entity if it will find that user with that username in a database, or it will return null if that user could not be found. So if there's no such user, then we will have the null here. So we need to handle this by simple if statement, where we just compare the user whether it is null, and inside this we throw the new instance of username not found exception, to which constructor we pass some message, and we will use here string format method to put the variables in the actual message text, and the message will be like no such user is name provided, and finally is the some variable, and put in this variable place the actual username string that was requested. Good. So if the user is not null and we do not throw the exception, so luckily we end up with the username and password, which we can obtain from the user entity. Username user get username, and here user get password, and we still need the authorities, and for that purpose we will create the collection of authorities where I'll put one single authority. So this collection from Java util package with a generic type granted authority. So this will have the reference authorities, and the implementation will be new array list that, and I will add one single authority to that list. Add, and here new simple granted authority, which will be exactly the same we put in the secured tag under the account flaw, this one. Put here. Now we have the authorities with one single authority inside, and we pass it to the user details instance, and then we return it. And you remember that we use only one single role user to avoid the complexity, so that we are not required to create the additional tables that hold the authorities. So it's totally fine for our simple tutorial application, so that we have only one role. And here we see that we put the message in the user not found exception constructor that will do the journey to user authentication provider, where we will catch that exception here and catch that exception and create the message which we put in the faces context, where we get that exception message here. So basically we get the string message here, which we put in this place. So again, we will get this text in this catch block here to construct our faces context message, which will be shown to the application user. Good. I'll save this. We also will use this method during an existing user authentication when we fill the sign in form. So I think that we should be able now to test some, to test user authentication. Okay. Yeah, also I will make some changes in the index.jsp, which purpose is just to redirect the initial application user to the entry point to the application, we wanted user to be redirected to the main flow. Now just instead of main, let's put here the account flow, so that user that wanna access the application at the root will be redirected directly to the account flow, and whether he's authenticated or not, then he will get the contents of that account flow, or he will be redirected to the sign-in form by the Spring Security. So this is clear, I hope, because we want to use this application to get the account contents and not the sign-in form. Okay. Let's compile the application and see how it beautifully works, I hope. Good. So now every time I access the application at the root, according to index.jsp, I will be trying to access the account. So if I want to access the J2EE application, then I am trying to access the account, and you see if I click, I get the sign-in form every time, because I'm not authorized to see the contents of that account. So let's go to the sign up form. So far so good. And now let's try to create the new user. Where's James Hetfield? JHead, and finally password. Okay. When I click sign up button, the three things should happen. The first is new user should be saved to the database table with all of these data. Second, the application should do the user authentication. And third, we should see the account, our account, right after I click this button. So let's see. Sign up and success. First of all, let's go and check if you have the new user in database. And here you see under number 4 the user details, user data that I just created, James Hetfield, with the username ghead and the hash password. So the first step is successful. The user is saved to database. And if we see the account, then this means that authentication went successful also, and finally we're redirected to the account flow. So great, superb. Then if we try to access the application root again, we should see the account. You see I go to the application root, and every time I get the account flow, unless I log out and invalidate the session. And there should be a cookie saved somewhere under this page. View cookies. And you see the Java session ID is saved in that small cookie file. And you see the contents, and the contents is the ID itself. And now let's try to log out the application account. So, and we had the logout. We had the logout functionality, if you remember, under the URL, which is app logout. Then we should go to our URL string and type here logout, and then the logout should be executed, and we should be redirected back to the sign-in form. So I hit enter, and here we are, back to sign-in form. And now if I access the application root, then I will not see the account anymore, and because I'm not authenticated, and you see I see only sign-in form. So everything works fine. Then I think that I should commit these changes at this point. Commit, create the account flow, configure Spring Security, protect account flow, and create DAO authentication. I think this will be better. Okay. I have all files selected, and then commit. Great. Now I am synchronized.